Oh wait, I forgot to ask consent. Or bench consent.
Testing. Okay, I'm going to be shouting. As in, I'm going to be speaking at this volume. Can I just confirm that everyone can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm just getting my shout-out script ready. Okay. Very quickly, guys, I don't usually do shout-outs, but in 2014, the little version of me decided to give this niche activity called Debating a Try, and the rest is history. I want to thank my parents who allow me to be unemployed so that I can do one final season of debating. I want to thank Malaya for embracing me after every win, but also after every loss. Despite this likely being my last time representing the institution, these 4 years have truly been the best of my life. I want to thank Viggy for bringing back my joy in debating. Viggy and I have been teammates for 2 months, and while it would have been exciting to see all the crazy achievements we would have gotten with just more time, the time that we had just means there's more to miss from this insane era that I don't think I'll ever forget. You're not a prodigy, Viggy, you're a phenom, and I just want to make that clear to you. I want to thank my girlfriend, Minami, who's not always here with me physically because of how maths and geography work, but whose presence I feel in my corner all the time. You're my inspiration every day for what I want to be, not just as a debater, but as a person. And finally, I want to thank all of you. The Malaysian circuit has some of the most talented debaters and some of the kindest people who I'm honored to call my friends. The trophies and medals collect dust in my cupboard, but the relationships I made will be something I always carry with me forever because they've truly shaped me as an individual. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. The anthropocentric of humanity means that everything that belongs on the earth is presumed to be one that belongs to humans. The skies above you, the clouds that you live under, the trees that grow around you, and the animals that you domesticate and the ones that are in the wild. The problem with this is that humans are not God. Humans are not angels. We are demons. We are the ones that are the most invasive species on this planet. We are the ones that have been causing great forms of dying of species around the globe, and I think it's time that we prefer a world that was not the one that we lived in, but on the one that is more accountable in nature. The first piece of framing that I have is on what status quo looks like. Firstly, this probably looks like major environmental resources like the Amazon, Arctic, and major rivers that sit inside state borders. What are governments able to decide on when they sit inside these borders? Government can decide things like extraction, shipping, mining, dam building, etc. But also in terms of conservation, which is one that falls under the government's prerogative. The problem here is number one, the tragedy of borders, where one state is able to capture all profits from the extraction, all profits and all revenue from the particular project of digging up stuff, but the cost and the harms of which is one that is spread throughout the globe. What does this look like? This looks like when you pollute the Amazon or when you cut down trees in the Amazon, the ability for it to absorb carbon dioxide for everyone is one that is lessened. When you pollute the ocean, the planktons that live in deep sea are unable to release oxygen for everyone else. The problem here, Judge, is that states don't have the best incentive. Why is this the case? Secondarily, it's on short political cycles that oftentimes the environment is seen as a long-term goal, one that isn't going to be politically beneficial in nature because people on the ground need food and need water and need a job. So what this means is that politicians often prioritize other election manifestos and other more important stuff like jobs, employment, and building of industries, which directly contributes to the devastation that we see the environment go through. But thirdly, it's regulatory capture, where oftentimes where you have a state, the ability for a state to benefit from a lot of the environmental resources hinges on lobbying by corporations. What this means is that corporations are able to lobby, to deforest, to conduct all other projects, etc. The second thing that I want to frame is what does our world look like? The first thing to note here is who controls this thing. This probably looks like the United Nations. This probably looks like the world, that like WWF, I think they can do this. But thirdly, this also looks like the World Seabed Organization that looks after pollution in the ocean. Secondly, how will this operate, two things to note. One is in terms of representation and safeguards, where the first thing is the voice that you have or the ability for you to vote is weighted against your population. But secondly, in terms of your indigenous and local communities, also have a special say in terms of veto power when it comes to land rights violations. And this is particularly important because this is the exact mechanism that we are using in order to give indigenous people who have been robbed of their voice and robbed of their say in an immediate and direct way. But secondly, in terms of issuing of permits, this is no longer going to be done by countries. This is going to be done by this very national authority where they can conduct different forms of research, different forms of data collection to understand what is going to be the implication of pushing for this particular project. The first argument that I want to push for, because this is the finals, it has to be a principle. This is going to be the principle of shared stewardship. The moral claim that I want to make is that the natural world belongs not to humans, but to humanity as a whole. Because Amazon regulates the oxygen and the rainfall. The Arctic regulates the world's temperature. The problem here is that when certain people get to decide what this looks like, that is when they take ownership of what isn't theirs. But secondly then, is why is national ownership one that is indefensible? Number one, the state that happens to sit above an ecosystem and ends up owning this particular area is not because they deserve it by way of merit. It's not because they deserve it because they're going to take care of it. It is an accident of geography. Number one, borders are arbitrary and have been drawn by your past colonizers in order to not care for the environment, but to benefit the colonizers at large. But secondly, in terms of the birth lottery, individuals don't choose the countries that they're born into. I can be born into Bangladesh, where I get a flood that destroys my house. I can be born into South Africa or some other part of Africa where droughts take away my agriculture, take away my food. And this is a problem because in your world where minorities don't have the ability to fight back, when minorities don't have the ability to say, the state doesn't own this, I own this, this is what becomes a problem. So when the actor's control determines the conditions of everyone else, that is when it is fair to forego the principle of sovereignty. Because sovereignty is meant to defend your resources. It is not meant to equalize the harm that everyone faces, even when they don't opt into your idea of sovereignty that's captured within your borders. How then do we embody moral equality to the best? Right now, you depend on goodwill. We turn this into a duty. Number one, we recognize everyone is equal. Secondly, we redefine the environment as a shared human right. And thirdly, we end the moral hypocrisy of rich states that do things like that do things like deforesting, that do things like mass projects that harm the environment. The impact of this is that the state will always put the environment on the back foot because of the existence of political cycles and other more important prerogatives. I think this is the point at which we are shifting that responsibility not just to a single organization, but one that is shared equally with everyone in the rest of the world. Go.
So is this going to be something that's gazetted by the universal jurisdiction, or is some level of resource extraction still going to happen?
I already said the people who give these permits are going to be your universal, is going to be this organization. The second argument then is how do we break the tragedy of borders? What is the tragedy of borders? And that refers to why there is no change in terms of environmental pushes because of fragmented incentives. Number one, every country only acts rationally for themselves. That's why Brazil deforests the Amazon for their soy exports. That is why the China and the US extract Arctic oil. But secondly, this is also politicization to a certain degree, that especially in contested borders, these resources become a political tool for our actors to be able to weaponize. That is why Trump wanted to annex Greenland so they could have access to the oil that exists within Greenland and take away resources from minority indigenous communities that exist probably there. The point is right now the incentives are screwed, and the way that we reshape those incentives is if we shift it to a global universal body. How then do we rewrite these incentives? Number one is centralized forms of accountability, where you have an accountable actor that you are directly able to manage and can monitor, and we are also able to call out this international actor given the influence that they have. Secondly, shared enforcement and collective funding. This means that at the point at which we spread the burden of conservation to everyone else that exists in the world, that is the point at which everyone will want to care, everyone will want to fund, everyone will want to donate. But thirdly, it's like collective justice, right? The first thing to note here is the visibility of violations, because the problem is in the status quo, corporations can violate your orang asli communities, they can violate your indigenous communities, but because they don't have a voice, but because they don't have a spotlight, this means the ability for them to fight back or to call out these corporations is one that is limited. But it is when you have the UN, it is when you have the WWF, and it is when you're sitting in board meetings to call out these corporations and say, what you have done to me is one that is incredibly unjustified, and I want you to be sanctioned, I want want you to be punished. These cries are ignored in the world of opening opposition and closing opposition. It is only in the world of government that you hear these cries being called out. The last thing I want to say in my speech before I end is that it is not just people suffering as a result of environmental harm. Globally, people are suffering as a result of genocide. People are suffering as a result of displacement. People are suffering as a result of mass wars. As debaters, it is our duty to not just care about the environment, but care about humanity as a whole.
Ibrahim for that fine speech. The opening piece of opening opposition. I invite leader of opposition. Here.
Thank God it goes that way. Hi everyone, my name is Atifa. First and foremost, I want to thank God for giving me this opportunity, for platforming me. I want to point out, and I feel like this isn't talked about enough, it's actually really jarring to be a hijabi woman, short, in the debate circuit. I do feel small at times, and every single time I'm on this platform, I'm just so grateful, so happy to represent the person I am. Second, shout out to IIUM, of course. Thank you for giving me these opportunities, for paying for me to go to so many different competitions, and thank you to the friends that I made along the way. You all mean so much to me. Thank you to my partner, teammate, best friend, Ibrahim, for just being here, being able to come this far with you is so nice. It's just the best thing that's ever happened to me. I want to shout out Anas for being my teammate for the bulk of my career and helping me come to where I am now. And lastly, I want to shout out my siblings who are my biggest support system, and my mother who is not here anymore, but she motivates everything that I do. Can you hear me? Like, am I close enough to the mic? Yeah. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Environmental resources are the most competitively sought after resource. Three reasons why. One, it's scarce in nature, meaning that you're heavily dependent on your geographic location in order to access them. Second, it's inelastic, meaning that the demand will never end. This is the starting point for a lot of economies to flourish. That's why these particular resources are so heavily depended upon within these developing states. But third, having these resources are a surefire way to create dependencies of developing states onto you. That's why the EU was emboldened in implementing the EUDR. That's why the US has the guts to put those palm oil sanctions onto Malaysia. This is all because they understand the best way to ensure that somebody has a dependency on you is to create that dependency with an inelastic, scarce goods such as these environmental resources. What are we going to posit to you? We're going to posit to you that the universal jurisdiction that OG wants to offer will in fact exacerbate these incentives, meaning that the moment in which you give this jurisdiction to an international power other than the sovereign state which owns these resources, this will be the tipping point for the most pernicious actors to act even more malevolently and maximize the reach of their horrible behavior. Illustrations first, and what did opening government leave out? Opening government's jurisdiction, universal jurisdiction, correctly pointed out, is probably going to look like all of the other universal jurisdictions we have. Your UN, your IMF, your World Bank, your WWF, the one with the panda. What does this look like? Three things. One, voting power will be dependent on your market share. This is something that they conveniently did not mechanize. But the reality is, within all of these other international organizations, depending on how much of that market or that resource that you own, you are the one who will be given ownership and jurisdiction over it. We've seen this with OPEC, only consisting of the countries which are rich with these particular resources. We've seen this with the US, which means that it's going to be the US and Canada dominating the timber jurisdiction section, Egypt and Ethiopia on clean water and major rivers, so on and so forth. I want you to notice the trend. These are the richest countries within their region or within the world themselves. Second part of characterization is that this does not exist independent of existing relationships. This means that China is still going to own the majority of African continent's natural environmental resources, but also that the US still owns most of Brazil's forests. We believe that these dynamics will be important in a second. But lastly, this is the UN. Regulations are on a convention basis. I don't know why suddenly this is going to become international law if even Netanyahu still does not care about anything that the ICC says. I don't think it's going to change. It's still going to be non-binding in nature. They need to prove to you as to why these developing states will suddenly all listen, which is not the fact that because they're dependent, because they're they've been neo-colonized. Note that these major environmental resources are the locations of great significance. What does this mean? It means that these are exclusively large capacity supplies of natural resources. This is something which is able to exacerbate state dependence, but also, of course, are of environmental concern, and there is a recognition that the harm is on a large scale, given that these resources are harmed. What does our world then look like? It looks like three things. It looks like status quo, which is three things. One, it is the existence of current regulatory actors, because I don't know why they want to act like, oh, we're going to have universal jurisdiction, and you guys are just going to do whatever you want, whenever you feel like it. That's not true. We still have things like FSC accreditation, which is a whole process which countries seek in order to have their products labeled as FSC approved in order to show that you are not rooted in deforestation. It looks like the EU is still regulating its market and providing advice and investments to countries which are interested in complying. Second, it looks like rational behavior of actors, which means that these countries like your Brazils and your Malaysias and Chinas are still going to have the awareness that you cannot put your eggs into one basket. There is still going to be a natural incentive to maximize the sustainability of resources and to invest your things otherwise and diversify your economy. But lastly, it looks like higher levels of political authority, because no, the ability to enact and implement laws within a country is secured within that sovereign state itself. We say that the best likelihood of these countries being able to actually put people in jail for illegal logging is only limited towards these natural things. But my case will engage that even if it is all binding, that is actually the worst form of their case, and they're going to lose. Sure.
So politics changes over time. Under Bolsonaro's administration, massive chunks of the Amazonian forest was deforested. Under Lula's administration, it was suddenly reforested. So on your side, it's obviously very inconsistent when it comes to the enforcement of those rules and of the implementation of them in the first place.
Yeah, governments change, but you know what doesn't change? The US's incentive to continue capitalizing upon the natural resources of an entire world, of oppressing these minority states, of the EU's incentive to continue doing these regulations which will actually limit Asia's ability to participate in the international timber market. These are incentives which don't change. You must prove why these actors will suddenly be good people when they never have been before. The highest burden you can ever take in the debate is that the US will be nice. That's why Just Now's motion is so up-heavy. First argument, why universal jurisdiction maximizes the malevolent incentives and capacities of these pernicious actors. And I want to premise this argument really clearly. Three reasons why this is just historically true, even absent universal jurisdiction. First, that it has historically always been this way. The US sanctioned Malaysia's palm oil to maximize the reach of their vegetable oil industry. The EUDR did this because they just don't want people to compete with them. Second reason why this is true is that the second part of this argument is that environmental resources are protectionist in nature. No, that these are less commonly used in diplomacy and trade deals, but also these are scarce in nature, which means the incentive for an individual to share those resources or to give way to another market is incredibly low. But last, the environment is often used for moral legitimacy because the West knows that the global South cannot afford to actually do these things, environmentalism, so on and so forth. That's why the EUDR is implemented, so that the EU can not only secure these economic benefits, but also seem like they're the best people on the face of the planet and make the global South look even worse than they do already, even though, I don't think we're that bad. How does this then exacerbate all of these pernicious behaviors? Two reasons. One, it legitimizes the control of these actors towards these resources, which means not only have they been trying to say that they have control, you are now legitimizing and acknowledging that, hey, the US gets to say what happens to Brazil's Amazon because this is the largest timber market on the planet. It means that. Second reason why is that the loss of these resources are not yours, but the profits are. Meaning that if the US manipulates this jurisdiction in order to benefit them, they will not suffer the moment in which the Amazon forest is destroyed because of the fact that their cash cows are domestic. This is just an extra profit incentive for them. This is why they're going to act perniciously. The next thing I'm gonna argue is our positive material. Please don't call me uncomparative again. How is national jurisdiction more likely to regulate benevolently? Three reasons. First, that the economy is largely dependent on it. Brazil knows, and Malaysia knows that they need their timber market and their oil in order to perform economically and internationally. Meaning that I don't know why they would just destroy it when they know that their market depends on it. So that means that's when you get Brazil being willing to reforest and to prevent clear cutting and to use irregular forestation for the sake of sustaining these resources. But also, this is the moment in which these countries will start to diversify their economy. Second reason is that there is reputation in good practices. This is why we see so many developing states seeking FSC accreditation for the sake of being able to say we're not as bad as the US claims. But third, the democratic legitimacy and fragility. These indigenous communities in their world have to hold the UN accountable. It is only in our world in which these people can go to their local MPs and complain on a regional level as to why these harms cannot happen. What are the impacts? One, the likelihood of risky behavior is way higher in their world. Second, you silence the voices of the global South. But third, this is the biggest violation of their own principle insofar that any of the benefits come with the suffering of the most vulnerable people. They cannot win the debate. Thank you.
new leader proposition for the point 3 to include the case of open government and direct deputy prime minister. Here.
If I speak from this distance, is it still clear? Yeah.
It will be louder.
Has to be louder, is it? Like this? Oh, okay. Okay, you know what? Yeah. Okay, nationals, I think that I have to do shout-outs first, right? So, this is my first BP nationals, so I'm really happy to be here. Woo! Hey, my first BP final, sorry. And I'm really happy to be here. And I want to thank all the people that have ensured that I've managed to get here so far. I want to thank both my contingents, that being Sunway and Malaya, for being really amazing institutions for me to learn, especially the people within it. So many people that within Sunway to Malaya and the journey that I've had in the past 4 years have really made me feel at home. I think that as someone that always kind of felt left out, it felt really nice to have a community for once. And I think that I'm really happy and proud of where I've come in this sport. The second person I want to shout out is my mom and dad. Especially my mom, honestly, because she used to force me to do debates instead of playing football and stuff like that. Thanks, mom, this is recorded. I think it paid off. The third person I want to shout out is, the friends that I made along the way who supported me for my debate journey, people who, despite being really annoyed at me coming for debates, still support me even though it means I don't hang out with them as much. The fourth person I want to shout out, because I'm supposed to break the internet or something, is my girlfriend Azrin. Thank you for giving me the spec for this motion. It's really good spec. The last person, and last but not least person I want to shout out, is my teammate Ahsan. When I first came into Malaya, I thought that you were a really cocky and arrogant guy. I still think you're pretty cocky and arrogant, but I think that you're an amazing person with so much of heart, man. And it breaks my heart to an extent that this might be our last tournament together. But for what it's worth, the past 3 months debating have been amazing. I think that it's amazing that you allow me to go crazy in prep, you allow me to go crazy in cases, and that's exactly why we're going to win. The national governments that opening opposition champions has failed you. It has failed you in our very nation of Malaysia, where on any panel that discusses environmental issues, 4 of the 5 panelists are people that come from the corporate sector, with 1 being an environmentalist. It has paid you when your MPs are paid off on a day-to-day basis to ensure that the degazetting of land is a non-issue in Parliament. It is such a non-issue that this off-bench team thinks that we live in a world that is fair. Every day that you are alive, an indigenous member of the community is oppressed. Every day that you are alive, an indigenous member of the community is silenced, and it's frankly quite abhorrent that this off-bench wants to pretend like these issues don't exist and sing kumbaya. I want to engage with this opening opposition team in 3 meaningful ways. The first assertion that they make is that these actors are going to be rational, hence good, referring to the States Assembly. I want to say first that this is just unengaging to the case that we hear from PM. Ahsan explains to you in great detail the politicization that occurs, the fact that the governments are typically short-termist in nature, the fact that the way politics operates in status quo is one that necessarily means that it's very, very difficult for you to prioritize the environment. Because how do you justify the environment? And Atifa rightly points this out, hello, when you need to debate about the price of eggs. How do you prioritize the environment, which is a long-term goal, when your political cycles want to see what you're doing for the economy? All of these things mean that the environment frankly takes a very big backseat in this debate. That's why they're so harmed in the first place. But the second thing that they say is that the international actors are terrible. The US, the economist entity, China wants to go into Africa and take all their resource. The first is this is a symmetric claim that has no value in the round. If these actors as bad as opposition wants to characterize, don't knife them by the way, CEO, then that means that this is exactly going to happen regardless of the incentive in the debate. Regardless of if it's the UN or not, these actors are going to permeate into your markets and try to take your land. But the flip here is simple, because the people that you are taking the land from are fundamentally different on our side. We say that when you go and you see a UN official there, when it is people who are peacekeepers, when it is people with international visibility, that's the point where you commit a transgression against an aboriginal, against a member of the population, against the environment. You kill tigers and elephants. That's when we give the visibility. That's when we get the call out. This team wanted to champion a side that they are fundamentally failing to defend. But even the best manifestation, where there's collusion between the UN and the US, even then, we literally mechanize to you via our fiat why necessarily veto power can be allocated towards the indigenous communities, etc. The allo case is just largely unengaging with the round. I don't think they know what the meaning of the word fiat is. The last thing that they say is, oh, these poor countries need a market and therefore are very smart in sustainability. The first, this is not true. Listen to the speech. I think that, listen to a PM speech. I think that engages with it regardless. So, considering that the responses are done, I want to prove 4 subsequent things in my speech. The first is on the positive comparative and why it's likely going to be one that is largely successful. Why are these international organizations so much better at conserving the environment? The first is the scale of knowledge they have access towards. These are bodies that have dedicated research across a multitude of sectors to understand how the environment best operates and to understand how to give the needs of the indigenous communities best. The second is they are immune to the types of political and capital pressures that exist in the comparative. And I want to weigh this against the best contention that come from op bench. Because op might say that the pressure and the lobbying is symmetric on both sides. But it's exactly where you are more immune, because you don't have A, political pressures, but B, by scale, a larger organization, that you therefore do not have the willingness to kowtow to these pressures as much. Last thing I want to talk about is the reason that the conservation is so much better is because this is a shared burden within the round. So the point where it is a shared collective agreement is precisely where the incentives of conservation are not just by one nation. So maybe we get a Bolsonaro there, but the adjacent nations hold them accountable to some degree at the very least. The second thing I want to talk about is minority communities in the debate. I'm going to turn off the mic, by the way. Status quo is one where we see that indigenous communities on a day-to-day basis have a deeply intricate relationship with the environment. There are people that view the environment as a part of their day-to-day living. Yet the second problem then is they're constantly undermined. You don't have to go far, judges. Go to Ampang, go to Selayang, go to the places in Malaysia to see how the indigenous communities are being mistreated on a day-to-day basis. The problem then is the scale of their mistreatment never gets represented. They have low social capital to voice out these issues. They are fundamentally small voter bloc. But thirdly, they have near zero visibility due to their detachment from society. So why then is this a problem within status quo? Judge, even though the UN has declared that the penultimate right towards land belongs to the indigenous community, we observe that across the globe, this is something that is desecrated on a day-to-day basis. Even though they have a right to land via specific articles, this is something that gets mistreated on a day-to-day basis. I'll take you a bit later. Why can we safeguard this? Number one, universal groups are specific groups that are much more incentivized to be pro-environment due to all the reasons that I've given you. But the second is they are much more immune to the types of pressures that exist within the state. So when the National Assembly is being pressured by other sects of the government, the international organizations are much more above this. The third, insane levels of capacity. They have huge amounts of resource. They have huge amounts of protections. They are much more able to regulate and deal with these things better. But the fourth is on the ideas of resource. Understand that it isn't just about capacity, but the incentive to meaningfully enact resource in a skilled way. I've already explained to you why typically these universal actors have a huge amount of knowledge. Sure, closing first. Okay, opening.
The UN has never intervened in Gaza beyond public statements. The IMF doesn't cover the states it works with, can't afford austerity. The EU...
Yeah, but this house prefers a world, so we have fear to say that that happens. I think you needed to engage with that in the first place. The second thing I want to do then is explain why the counterfactual is so much worse. Number one, precedents within the status quo. States have abused this on a day-to-day basis because they want to simply sell you to the lowest bidder. Second, they typically have antagonistic views towards local communities. If this thing wanted to cry about colonization, it is exactly the colonized white people in Brazil that are persecuting the indigenous communities on a day-to-day basis. The second thing I want to talk about is the geopolitical structures of this debate. I want to note that in status quos, rivers, seas, land, the underground mining, etc. are typically used for heavily geopolitical issues. Bigger nations bully you, smaller nations threaten you, you disenfranchise minorities and non-combatant civilians on a day-to-day basis via dirty tactics. Why do we resolve this meaningfully? Number one, the international community is simply much more representative. The point where we posited you a model that is shared ownership is the point where we get to prevent this. The second is peacekeepers angle discussions very differently to make sure not so antagonistic. The third is that explains necessarily why countries want to operate here, because there's an insane level of international relations reputation that you gain the point where you do this. The weighing here is simple. We explain to you a principle that largely goes untouched in the debate. We explain to you why these incentives are the most important in the round. We explain to you why centralized accountability and the levels of respect that people have to the UN mechanizes our goal. Judge, we've given you 5 arguments that are still standing by the end of my speech. We've weighed them. If that doesn't win a debate, I don't know what does.
Here.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech. To conclude, he's an opening opposition and rights Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
I just give him some positive quotes.
Oh shit, missing paper. Yeah, paper. Hi. So this is my third ever finals. I'm extremely honored to be here. I owe my thanks, of course, to my creator, with whom I wouldn't be living, I wouldn't be breathing, and I certainly wouldn't have been born to be able to attend these finals and be here in the first place. Secondarily, I owe it to my family, who genuinely have no idea what debating is about, and this is the second time making the joke, but essentially, if they knew what debating was about, I probably wouldn't be here either. Also, I just wanted to shout out my mom. She hasn't been here for a long time, since 2016 she passed away. So I wonder how she would be feeling if she saw that the things that I have accomplished, although small in nature, but to me it's somewhat big, you know. So I hope I'm making my mother proud. Also, if you're giving us the applause, you're not giving the win to Tuan Ayam team. So, and last but not least, Atifa, my wonderful partner and teammate, who has opened my eyes towards myself, has allowed me to understand that I am more than just that underperforming senior, that I have more things that I can achieve, and have achieved many great things with her, thankfully. She is the person who has molded me into the Baim that I am now, and without her I don't think I'd be nearly as competent of a debater if I am to be considered one.
and I would have a lot of deficiencies as a person. So I owe my thanks to her. Damn gay. Anyways, yeah. OG's case is predicated on the protection of indigenous communities. The problem with this is A, that it is an insanely high burden to prove. It is insanely symmetrical, the amount of struggles the indigenous communities go throughout the entire world. I'm unsure as to how, when you add on the magnification of that, because of the considerations that they have to do with all of these different countries, it's somehow going to be easier. But B, this is a last-minute extension coming from Ahsan in the last minute of his speech. This shouldn't be credited heavily beyond Vigneshwaran's extension. 3 things that I'm going to be tackling them. Number 1, on shared stewardship. Number 2, on politicization of resources. And thirdly, on accountability. Firstly, on shared stewardship. Shared stewardship, why is this mechanism damning in the first place, right? A, it's disproportionate. In order for you to fulfill your principle that OG is trying to account for, you have to allow that to be symmetrical or at least proportionate access to these resources in status quo. That is impossible because they themselves concede that those that have a larger market share, those that have a larger priority within this state, within this major resource stake, are probably going to have a larger say. The likely frame then is what Atifa tells you, that the developed countries or the most pernicious actors within the globe are likely the ones that are going to be able to wrest control from these major environmental locations. B, these capitalistic countries are more harmful for the environment than you may think, right? OG is basically saying they're okay with the UN and all of these developed countries that have veto power to be able to wrest control of this environment. The problem, A, US forest fires. They have repeated environmental problems within their own country because they do not care enough about the environment. This has also been repeated through the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, the UEDR, all things which developed countries have bailed out of because it is too big of a cost for them to care about the environment in their road of planning, in their plan of paving the way for the economic development. But secondly, the trash from developed states often ends up within developing states. The problem with this is that it shows a blatant disregard for the environment, that these developed states have. I don't know why you're here hearing the problem is developed states or the developing nations themselves prioritizing this problem. And C, essentially just the basic mechanism of capitalism. You cannot get success without exploitation of more vulnerable actors. The problem here is that when you grant universal access to these jurisdictions, what that then means is that the most pernicious actors, as like ad nauseum, this has been talked about by Atifa, are going to have access. If they want to talk about the US having access to the Arctic and plundering them for oil, this happens to a larger degree the moment in which they have larger amounts of autonomy over this jurisdiction. Likely, the frame is what Atifa tells you, that those that can access legitimacy in international organizations are always the worst actors. There must be the nations that are safeguarding their own national resources. Before I get to my second point.
Capitalists and the rich countries of the world gain influence by the blatant and violent exploitation of developing countries. In the world that we prefer, they would have never been able to do this because we would have put a stop to it. Therefore, our world is much better.
The problem is that in order for these developed countries to develop in the first place, there is some form of gospel and glory, which is basically what Ahsan mentions in the argument previously, to wrest control of this. When you have this new world where it's reinvented with universal jurisdiction, this is still likely going to be the case to an exacerbated degree because of the fact that they have unfettered access into these environments. Comparatively, what happens in our world? We prove to you that these nations are likely going to be able to safeguard this. And importantly, secondarily, I also want to flag out why the mechanism doesn't work. They claim it's led by minorities, but A, they have no international leverage. Non-binding nature of UN is that people won't listen to these minorities because of the fact that they generally just don't have a lot of power or control within the global stage. Look at all the ceasefire agreements that have been proposed. Countries just don't listen if they have enough power because they can afford to. Secondly, people listen to the UN because of US and China and the power that they have. They are bad actors. They are likely to plunder and discriminate against the individuals within these locales. Secondly, on the politicization of resources. This is likely symmetrical, but the problem with this damningly on opening government is the fact that there are close to no forms of recourse for the nations that have their resources plundered. Sit down. If the ability for them to access these resources is limited, what is likely to happen is A, things like the access being restricted because of this international jurisdiction. So if there was a need for Ethiopia to gain access to the Nile River, or Egypt in and of itself to gain access to the Nile River, this is likely stunted because of the fact that they have to go through bureaucratic processes in order to get bloody water to survive. Developed countries are likely to wrest control. Look at the G7, look at Canada and US with the lumber hegemony that they have. Number two, negotiations are likely to be more difficult. You can leverage comparative advantage under your side, sure, but you can go only as so far as your influence exists. If you are a developing nation, if you do not have a lot of power within the global market, it is unlikely that your negotiations are going to be effective. This is impacting what Atifa had already mentioned. Number three, resources are going to be stripped bare. If you resorted to utilizing the Amazon forest for you to survive, for your economy to develop, maybe like terms go on, maybe like your plans change, but the reality is that it is on magnitudes lesser than what the West and what the global developed are going to be able to do. Engaging with their best case. Caveats for local nations to tap in is extremely limited in this instance, therefore resources are likely to be wrested away from them. Maybe, like best case, environment is better, but the reality is that you're still depriving humanity of their essential ability to live. The positive material that we have then is that A, we have better autonomy. We have that because of these individuals having direct access to essential resources, maybe they probably have a lesser likelihood of dying. Number two, proximity. The ability for you to understand the nuances of the habitats and all of the environments that exist is directly correlated to the proximity geographically that you have to these locations. And thirdly, democratic mechanisms. Because of the fact that you have this comparative advantage that you're able to offer to other countries, it's likely that you have more leverage in the global scale. So if Brazil or whatever other country like Egypt or Ethiopia didn't have a seat before this, now they do. Number four, smaller power disparity allows them to be held accountable to a larger degree. Third, and lastly on accountability, right? They say that every country prioritizes themselves, resources become a political tool, and all along actually fighting against corporations becomes harder. Accountability, the power to empower indigenous communities is asserted, but the reality is that because of what I mentioned in my opening line earlier, the ability for them to largely be held accountable is harder because A, it's far easier to get away because of the power that the UN has. Maybe you see someone with the UN sticker and you're afraid of them, that's exactly why they're going to be able to get away with it because of their power. B, you magnify the number of actors that are to be considered. What this then means is that because maybe you care about indigenous communities in one place, now you have to care about indigenous communities in all of these different diasporas of environments. You're likely not going to be able to do this to a very well or significant degree because every country mistreats the indigenous people. Therefore, if you already don't care about your one, you won't care about others even more.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that speech. So opening the closing of the debate, and by member of the district.
Actually, I'm just gonna yell because no one uses. So a couple of shout outs. Firstly, shout out to my family. Shout out to Malaya and Ihsan also for all the guidance that I've had. Shout out to all the people that I team up with. Specifically Mior, Tanish and Shenzhou for all the nations that we've been to. Shout out to Wesley. I hope that this performance can extend to Oxbridge or even words. Maybe not, but hopefully it does. Okay. natural resources are often the easiest way in order for a nation to prosper economically, and that is what led to the unequal rate of development that occurred amongst nations, and that also led to massive inequality that occurred amongst the global south and the global north. That will be the first extension. The second one will talk about how the universal jurisdiction changes this in ways that are fundamentally good, changes the pace of development in ways that are fundamentally better. The first reason that I want to explain here is that the rate of development often occurs in ways that are unsustainable and in ways that are unequal. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Because nations have instead want to finish up their resources. Firstly, because it's a war of attrition to consume as much resources as possible to export and profit as much money that you are able to get from that particular object. Which means you are more incentive to pollute rivers if you're able to maximize your output in a particular factory. You are more way to bulldoze large swaths of land in order for you to be able to get things like timber to export to other countries as well. Secondly, when things like wars happen, it's the usage of herbicide in Vietnam, the dispute over the Nile River, the imposition of soft power over resource-rich nations, they oftentimes instigate conflicts within those areas, which is why oftentimes natural resources are something that's very politically contentious because nations fight over those things in ways that are harmful. But worse, it is also now an incentive for nations to do things that target farmlands, oil rigs, build dams to prevent the flowing of the river because they knew that it is something that is so valuable. That is the point in which they are likely going to do something about it in ways that are obviously very, very harmful, that obviously tries to jeopardize the development of that particular nation. But thirdly, these resources simply cannot stay as it is, right? It must be used for things like commercial purposes or things like warfare. You bulldoze forests, you pollute rivers, you extract huge amounts of oil to be used for things like warfare and commercial purposes. They only benefit yourself, which is why oftentimes you have things like the invasion of Iraq, you have things like the war on terror, you have nations colluding and cooperating with one another in order for them to be able to gain resources at the expense of other nations that are going to potentially gain those resources. Thirdly, this often means that the nations that are resource deficient from the start die out in the global economy because there is nothing to trade for and they are often neglected in their development and therefore they start off economically slower. But conversely, nations that have a concentrated amount of resources either monopolize those resources to be inaccessible, like oil in the Middle East, or rapidly deplete them internally to develop as fast as possible, which means that oftentimes, even if there is resources is used in ways that are unproductive or in ways that are simply just unsustainable on their comparative because of the incentives of nations to want to preserve themselves and develop and outdevelop one another. This often means this is something that's very harmful because I would agree that these are something that might be reversible or might be irreversible, but the issue here is that these are things the nations are just unaware about because their decision-making calculus changes to outcompete the rate of development of other countries as opposed to caring about their own environment in the first place, which means that is the reason as to why even if they have an incentive for them to want to continue and maybe transition to a greener economy, the impetus and the resistance against it is a lot higher because people are a lot more comfortable with the status quo and more comfortable with things like pollution because of the convenience that comes with it, which is why there's an impetus for you to want to make sure that these things don't transition or don't gain as much popularity in the near future. How does therefore the universal jurisdiction changes this in ways that are better? Firstly, you often set up preemptive limits on how much land can be used, how much rivers can you pollute. You enforce regulations on things like the export of resources and existing treaties like the Paris Climate Accord or the Kyoto Protocol. The extent of commodification reduces because there are now clear financial costs of the violation of those guidelines and regulations, and therefore, if nations choose to violate and choose to bulldoze large swaths of land without the permission of this universal jurisdiction, they are likely going to be penalized very, very heavily on our comparative, which is why you have an incentive to want to not do these things and find other more productive avenues of development. Secondly, this also means that they are less vulnerable to things like corporate capture because the core mechanisms are a lot more receptive because you're able to advocate for the distribution of those resources that allow for more equitable pace of development. You're able to ensure things like timber, you're able to ensure things like oil are able to be shipped, able to be exported to areas that are resource deficient because these are things that are no longer commodified to the extent in which it is, and therefore these things are able to go to those areas as well. But more importantly, the global north as it is right now is developed because they were significantly more willing to forsake the environmental protection for economic growth and use that growth to plunder and exploit the resources of other nations via the power asymmetry that existed. So they might argue, well, this is natural jurisdiction, so surely they have some ability to be able to enforce these kinds of things. The issue here is even if there is national jurisdiction, these are things that are significantly more vulnerable to things like the imposition of soft power. These are significantly more vulnerable to things like economic leverages that exist over these nations, which is why that power asymmetry is something that is able to bypass national jurisdiction because they are able to take advantage of it
in ways that benefit their own trade and benefit themselves first and foremost. Which is why even if you have sovereign control over your own economy, for example, because you don't have the same kind of capital or the same kind of economic development as another nation, that nation therefore has a lot more say and a lot more influence over the way in which you regulate your own environmental policies and the way in which you implement your own environmental outcomes. Lastly, the rate of development changes in ways that are better, and this is why you get the era of green technology and the era of the circular economy is one that is ushered in a lot quicker. Before that, sure.
CJ's case is privileged, ignorant, and discriminatory. They say convenience, we say essential sector to the economy and the provision of low-skilled labor. They must tell you why these things will not happen to the most vulnerable in their world.
But they don't prove as to why these things are necessarily going to be any better on their end. Because we explained that because resources are often distributed in ways that are either concentrated or deficient, it's just simply unclear as to what happens on their end when one nation profits at the expense of another nation, or when one nation is able to gain resources at the expense of another nation. So on their side, it's just relatively unclear as to whether or not you're able to have the same kind of equitable distribution of these resources. Lastly, on why the rate of development is far better, because there's no longer a race to the bottom when it comes to your own development. Therefore, there are incentives for you to want to maneuver and change the trajectory of your development, because you know that if you do these things now, the financial cost that comes with you violating these things obviously offsets the kinds of profit they're able to make when you pollute the environment. Therefore, you have more incentive to want to invest in things like R&D for green technology far earlier on. You have more incentive to want to ensure that you invest in secular parts of the economy earlier on. You want to ensure that these things come in earlier on before these things occur in the first place. Which is on our end, not only are you able to have a more sustainable version of the economy, one in which you're able to complement for resource deficient nation, but more importantly, we experience to why on our comparative, the only way for you to do this is via the universal jurisdiction. Because that is something that's significantly harder for you to be able to bypass and use your own leverage over others. Because even within big nations, there are conflicting interests between one another. But on their side, you obviously pick and choose your allies. You engage in things like proxy wars, for example, with other nations. At least on ours, you discuss at the table first and foremost, and you're able to ensure that these things come to a consensus decision, as opposed to on their side, where these things occur as it is, and therefore it's just a lot harder for them to be able to obtain these kinds of things. So, so this is the end of the speech. But I just want to say that it's been a huge privilege for me to debate within the Malaysian circuit. A lot of you have immense amount of potential, and obviously there is a brighter future for Malaysia. There's a brighter future for the circuit. I sincerely wish the best for the Malaysian circuit as a whole, and for it to grow as it is right now.
Next member of government will invite speech to open the closing opposition speech and by member of opposition. Thank you.
Hello everybody. Romance is different from romance. Sorry, Praveen.
So I don't usually do shoutouts, but I'll do one today. First of all, shout out to Malaya for having the best contingent around and the best seniors that I look up to and learn from so much every single day. It's really a blessing to debate with you guys every single session. I wouldn't be the speaker I am today without y'all. Second, shout out BSC for actually kind of like wanting me because I didn't know what the hell debate was. So thanks for that, guys. Of course, it's all y'all are amazing. Keep it going with BSC. We love you guys. Okay, lastly, shout out to Yenju. Insane teammate. I would never have started this and never gone anywhere I wanted to without this man. Thank you so much. Whatever happens this round, we lose so whatever, we win so whatever. Got you. The problem with this debate so far is that it's unclear to me as to why creating environmental change is the only metric by which you should evaluate this debate on. Opening gets deadlocked in a debate on the incentives of actors and how they are likely to behave. OG says they are likely to do this well, OO says they are predatory actors that act in their own way. But the problem here is that this is uncertain. If they are good, then maybe this works. But if they are bad, then you are definitely cooked on either side. The problem with this opening bench is that their impacts are largely speculative in the round as a whole. What does closing government tell you? CG says that it's about equitable resource distribution. But the problem here, and the thing that you need to note, is that this is still locked with the frame that OO posits as to how exactly are these actors going to behave insofar as you want to ensure that this resource equitability is something that's better. The way closing opposition will enter this debate is to provide some context as to the timeline as to when this debate is likely happening and why the ability for national jurisdiction to be held was an essential step in the past to creating the kinds of environmental change that we have now. The first frame here, which is at what point is this debate likely happening at? It's probably at a post-colonial period when the sovereignty of nations are being established and drawn up. This means discussions as to who gets what forms of land are probably being had or things like that. But the second thing then is that it's important to note that the biggest bulk of these resources oftentimes exist within developing countries because of things like geographical positioning, when you're positioned near the equator or positioned between the Asian region as a whole. This is why colonizers come to Asia in the first place, to rob us of our spices, to rob us of our resources. But these are oftentimes the nations and the countries that are most reliant on these resources and have these things to the biggest degrees in the first place. The second thing I want to frame out here, which is the incentive of creating environmental change that are actually wanted. Note that this exists in the major sense because the debate isn't necessarily about just locking resources away and what's better than. It's about a shifting mindset and how you create sustainable change that goes beyond. The problem with opening half is that neither team explains why just taking away major resources specifically changes mindsets of states and things like that. But the problem here is that the problem still exists, where states are still predatory, states are still going to exploit certain forms of environments. The impact that I'm positing to you here is that it's unlikely to be something that changes, or it's unlikely to be a way in which you're able to shift states to care about the environment as a whole. This is locked in the opening half. The third thing I want to talk about here is what are the current ways of environmental progress so far. Note that if you look at the actual trajectory of the world, we have made insane amounts of environmental progress from the times of the Industrial Revolution and the past. Things like carbon emissions being reduced in so many countries, things like the Paris Agreement working to some degree. Even if we agree that some countries haven't complied, the extent of impact that these things have been able to do is monumental. The debate then says that economic incentives will always prioritize environmental ones. But Judge, the important thing to note here is that economic incentives are tied with environmental incentives. This means there is oftentimes the incentive of caring about the environment. There is oftentimes things that gain you economic leverage and economic credibility to grow your nation. Look at things like carbon trading. Look at things like green technology being developed. Look at things like green marketing, where H&M lies to you about the quality of your t-shirt every single week. These are incentives that society cares about right now. I'll explain to you why this is something that couldn't happen in this world when we have a universal jurisdiction. The next thing I want to talk about then is on why exactly was natural jurisdiction something that's absolutely vital to a shifting narrative. Note that in a post-colonial world, or in a world where these things were first being enacted, the economies were likely weak. These countries were probably suffering with people dying and oftentimes being in extremely poor states of poverty. What does this mean in the debate? It was the ability to access fundamental resources that help these nations grow and cater to the needs of their people. This looks like essential resources within the Amazon forest, like water extraction that was needed from Brazil to help starving, dehydrated people, resources to build baseline levels housing, resources to build key infrastructure that existed. The tipping point here is that even within these countries' ability to rebuild themselves, it was access to these resources in the first place. But secondarily, how did these countries grow their economies as a whole? It was probably two things like the sales of resources. Shortly after these post-colonial periods was probably when the boom of the Industrial Revolution happened, where insane demand for rubber and other forms of important resources existed. These are things that then give these poorer, smaller nations the ability to then leverage their economies and do things that are fundamentally important in alleviating and creating some level of stability within their nation. The important thing then is to note that this is the country that then use these particular resources and use these economic profits to diversify their economy, opt into other forms of industries that weren't as reliant on their environment as a whole. The impact here is that I'm proving to you why the incentive to care about the environment can only exist in a world where you are particularly concerned about it and you don't have the same economic priorities that governments want to talk about barring you and harming you in the first place. We'll admit and we'll take the trade-off, because in the short term now, you're probably thinking, what form of environmental change are we making? Because it sounds like the environment is dying. But I'll explain to you that this was a necessary trade-off in making the bigger, more effective long-term environmental changes that we get in the future. I'll take you in a bit, Ahsan. So the impact here is about changing the shifting mindsets of people on the ground, because people are no longer poverty-ridden and in better life circumstances. This gives them more incentive to look at issues like the environment, which oftentimes did take the backseat in the past. But secondly, this was the prerequisite condition to creating that recognition and creating that incentive to then want to care about the environment. What does the comparative look like on the world of GovBench? One, they don't explain to you the point in which these particular universal jurisdictions exist. How are countries going to branch out at this juncture of the debate? One, you probably can't opt into industrialism because of the same asymmetries that closing government wants to talk about. Which is because you need the infrastructure, you need the innovation, you need to match the same Western countries to be able to do this. So under their side, countries oftentimes get locked in economical poverty or are unable to alleviate themselves from these issues in the first place. This exacerbates the harm on their side. I'll take you. Because of the fact that you're never able to pivot out of this ability to prioritize these environmental issues in the first place. Go, Ahsan.
So closing government wraps the gift of OG with a different wrapper, but we told you that if we did this last time, the capitalists wouldn't have been that rich anyway. They wouldn't have taken as many resources. The developing countries would have more.
This is just a little lie in the debate because the capitalists have multiple other avenues aside from the environment. They had industrialization, they had the ability to negotiate, and the same asymmetries that you want to break that consistently exist. Under our side, it's not about stopping the capitalists, it is about breaking the ability for developing countries to find relevancy and stability in themselves. The reason this cannot exist under the comparative is that the likelihood of these countries being able to alleviate themselves from poverty is something that's largely diminished. This puts a lot of your environmental issues on the back foot. This means that the likely incentive to create the current levels of trajectory of innovations that we have now are things that are likely to be backset. Incentives like the IMF imposing conditional loans and other things are all mechanisms that still work in the debate, but it's about your ability as a state to subscribe to these narratives, to subscribe to the incentive to join in environmental care is that the winning metric in this round. How did we achieve this? It is on our side right now in status quo that you see Malaysia pivoting to different forms of energy. It is our side right now that sees the reason as to why Malaysia has solar panels. Under their comparative, you never had the capital to prioritize these things in the first place. This gov bench puts a plaster on the issue as a whole because they just take away land from you, but they never actually shift the mindset of how these people behave. And this is why we way over our opening. Because OO doesn't engage as to why the fundamental need of this was important to the productivity of change that we have now.
Thank you, Member of Office, for that fine speech. Concludes the gov bench as a whole and invite government with Jezza.
Hello. Hello.
Wait, am I audible like this? Okay, I'm putting a bit loud. Okay, so I'm audible like this, right? So I suppose I put some shout outs now. So I'll give some shout outs to my institution, University Malaya. Rashfin in the crowd there. Thank you for coming in. I also like to thank Sunway as well because it was in Sunway that I first started debating, and I honestly think all the experience I got there from everyone around me honestly really pushed me to be where I am today. Without that, I probably would not have come back into debate nor stayed in it. It was not just Viggy that made me stay in debate actually. Yeah, so there's a lot of names I'm not going to mention because I'm scared I might miss out some and then get cancelled for it. Yeah, I also want to thank my family, my mom, dad, who I don't know if they'll watch this or understand what I'm saying because they always say I talk too fast, but I told them that's the meta, so. Yeah, so unlike everyone else, I don't have a girlfriend to shout out. Ahsan has one, Vicky has one, Raymond has Wesley. Yeah, so I am unfortunately stand up. But yeah, so I guess there is someone I want to thank. Someone who was very close to me. We have not spoken in a long time, but honestly, the last time that I did speak to her, I was not a national champion. I am not working at AVP. I am not any of the achievements I have today. So yeah, I just want to give her a shout out for being there for me when I was broke and nothing. But now I'm here at the national final stage for 2 years in a row. the problem in this debate, and it is the only problem that CG doesn't suffer from, is that every other house does not actually incorporate what other actors look like in their cases. Because it seems that opening government wants to run a kumbaya world where suddenly the minorities have all the power in the world, and everyone is going to be okay with this, and that they're going to allow the veto powers towards your smallest minority groups. That suddenly everyone is going to be aware of every single cultural nuance. They don't explain as to why it is likely then that the actors within these organizations that they cite, or which is why that they don't explain as to why the universal jurisdiction is one that's likely going to be able for these people to have and exercise this amount of authority and agency then. But also opposition that does not explain as to why it is national sovereignty, which is one that's going to work well in the first place, or why it is still not going to be open to the exploitations of your bigger actors then. So let's just take out opposition from this debate then. I think there's two things that come out from opening opposition that also come out in CEO. First thing then is about as to why developing countries need the access to these resources in order to build up the economies then. So this is entirely true. We explain to you why. It's very unlikely then that this is the only, that opposition's model is the only way in which you can unlock this benefit. Because Raymond explains to you then that it is through this universal jurisdiction that you actually get discussions as to how you want to get more equal development then. Because it's not likely that, oh, the country who's dying and needs water, such as CEO points out, it's very unlikely then that your universal jurisdiction is going to look at a country that's literally suffering and say, you know what, we're not going to give you the resources because it's not yours, it's a universal thing. It's very likely then that the provisions you set up there have the regulations to allow countries who desperately need it to be able to access this. The point in which the regulations come is to tell these countries the way in which they access these resources has to be ones that's sustainable. Raymond explains to you why this is likely to be true. He mentions then that the inception of this is, and this is a THP motion by the way, so it means then that the actors are likely going to, that this is going to change from before the inception of where we are in status quo, which means then that the way that economies are set up and the way that societies are developed means that it comes from the pretext that it is centered around discussion. This stops then the exasperation of your industrial societies wanting to exploit things, because the point which we understand that these things are universal goods that everyone has a say in, which means then that everything has to be discussed before you allocate its resources. So it proves to you two things. One, as to why it's likely going to be regulated, as to why people aren't going to be able to exploit these things and completely ruin these things. But secondly then, as to why people still have an incentive to want to help each other out, because they operate on a communal basis, on a universal basis. That shifts as to how economies view themselves, because they don't seem as viewed as isolated and as singular as what happens on OO when during the industrial era everyone was basically out in a race in order to beat everyone out. It is with this pretext then of a universal jurisdiction and understanding that they have to participate in these sort of communities, which is where then you do not get people actively destroying these communities, because one, they know that these are things that are shared with everyone else, so they just get a lot of backlash and people will just not like them for it. But secondly then, they understand then that these are also perceptions that will go back onto them because of the fact that they have to share these spaces with other people, which is where then they're likely going to be more careful towards it. But they're not going to exploit these things because they understand then that whatever harms they do unto these are going to be held against them, and that's what they're going to get punished. And secondly then, they explain as to why, it's very likely that developing countries know how to handle these things because of the fact that they need it and therefore they won't ruin it. They don't substantiate this to any degree then, because if they are as desperate as you say, and these countries are as developing and do not have the capabilities in order to delve in towards your green technology and things like that, it's the exact reason as to why they are not able to run these things properly. It's because of the fact that they are desperate. It is because of the fact that they are poor countries who cannot afford the most sustainable measures of extracting these sort of resources, which means then it's very likely going to take the cheapest option out. It's very likely then, because you do not have any external actors who are actively regulating them, they have no incentive then to want to take care of these things insofar that they know that as long as it doesn't completely stop the economies, they can continue to do these things, and any environmental harms that come after are secondary towards the economic benefits. Before I move on, POI.
Number one, you just strawman our Mac. Number two, in this reimagining of ops world, capitalists of developed countries would still conquer the world because they're not conquering for access to the Amazon. It's
okay, on capitalism then, Raymond explains to you why this is something that curbs capitalism or decelerates it to a good degree. Because the way in which the capitalists move and the way in which industrialist societies grow was the extraction and was the exploitation of resources. It was your iron mines that built the industrial era. It was your silver and your gold and all these sort of things which built these sort of industries. Which means then, a point in which where there's an inception of a world where these things and these resources are inherently regulated and ones that are universal, which means then there's not being able for the UK to directly scrape up these things. It is not able then for US and all these things to be able to extract these resources to the degree where they develop towards what your capitalistic tendencies trend towards. And the exact reason as to why this happens, Raymond explains to you then. It is because of the fact that now there's an equal distribution of resources, because of the fact there is no longer the perception that, okay, I'm in a race against someone else who they are likely going to abuse their resources because no one is stopping them. My choice is now to lose out to them in the race or also abuse my own resources. This is what leads towards capitalism. This is where you got your arms race and your war of attrition. It is when you remove this calculus and you remove this incentive by introducing international jurisdiction on towards these things, which is where then you stop this. Because all you need on side opposition is for one country or one major power in the world to want to abuse their resources, to give justifications to any other countries in the world, to then abuse these things in response to this, which is where you got the US and Russia constantly doing like bad shit crazy things to to ensure to win the space race for no other reason than just to outdo the competitors. It is when you stop the first person from doing this in the first place, which is where you stop these capitalistic, the worst and the most pervasive versions of capitalism to happen on your side of the world then. But what is the second argument that comes out from and why they also don't win this? They explain as to why, it'll be manipulated by the West when you allow them access into towards these places then. This is false because it actually is far worse on your side. Raymond explains to you as to why, especially on your frame where it's the most developing countries who use this, when it's far easier to manipulate a single country, which is where you get your proxy wars, which is where you get foreign investments like China investing in Africa in order to individually manipulate all these countries, where you get the US coming into South America to individually manipulate all of these countries. This is a harm that exists only on your world, where there's some form of national sovereignty, but this means jack shit when these countries literally cannot live on their own and economies are bad. You have to explain as to why they're able to withstand foreign influence. We explain the mechanism here. She works better on scale because when you have an internal, you have a universal jurisdiction where you allow differing actors to counterbalance each other. Because it's not just the US coming into small countries, it's the US versus Russia. That's why opposition out of this debate. How then do we take it over opening government? I think opening government lives a bit in a utopia because the entire argument is predicated on minorities, which is to be expected from Vigneshwaran and Ahsan, but they don't substantiate as to why it's not as one that works. Because again, the main push that comes out from them is that minorities will have the biggest say and they will stop these things. But they don't explain one as to why this happens in the first place or why it's sustainable. Because it is true then that the same actors exist. You still have your Russians and your US and your majority white people. They don't give you the mechanism as to why they're not likely going to abuse these things. Raymond just explains to you a far simpler case. He says then that it is not about minorities. It is about how you ensure the equal development of economies, which means then that you don't leave these things towards your oil barons and towards your families who take over all these things and your private companies. These are the actual practical changes, which means that on your side, minorities are far better. Because when these things are controlled by international communities, it is then where you take these things away from corporations. It's where you take these things from oil families and oil barons, who are the ones that choke out all of these profits, and these things go towards them instead of your minorities. So we unlock to you far better words in terms of global scales of economies, but we explain to you as to why these things trickle down to just basically better benefits for your minorities, because these things do not go in the hands of the corporations, which is what OG missed in this debate. For all those reasons, then take CG.
Thank you, Gavin, for that fine speech. To conclude this COPs and the debate as a whole, I invite opposition whip, Syakir.
Can I be heard on this volume? Cool? Right. Just a couple of shout outs. I think first is just to shout out to my parents that just basically just fund me for tournaments sometimes and just being carried if I choose to yell to a laptop in a weekend and not being just not the money them. I think second is just to shout out to my past institutions, BAC. I mean, without BAC, I won't be picking up debate again. And the third one, I think, is just Malaya, from almost not making it to the team, to not making the squad, to not being lucky and break AVP, and being lucky to enter internationals. I think I owe Malaya a lot. I think I share my honor together with y'all.
Let's go, Junior!
My first ever nationals, I died at novice semis. My second ever nationals, I died at open pre-quads. This is my third nationals. I finally made it. Starting my pitch in 3, 2, 1. I'll first deal with environment preservation on OG, second deal on equal distributions of CG, and lastly way over OG. I think it's just too quick to identify what's the problem on OG then. OG claim that their model is UN control, they're able to give them the best form of representation, second veto power if you have indigenous people in your rural area. I think this is extremely problematic in twofold. First, this model is extremely flawed and sketchy because you are still very likely to get manipulated by other Western actors and also powerful actors. I think the second problem is just UN regulation is extremely tokenistic. Look at what happened recently. Israel blocked humanitarian aid in the conflict zone. This is strictly regulated and this is strictly prohibited in war zone, that you're not allowed to block out humanitarian aid towards war zone, which means that UN regulation itself is actually tokenistic and it will only favor towards the majority. They will only favor towards the first world country, national superpower. The last thing I want to argue is that UN will still be a lapdog to all these major power because they still contributed majority of the funds towards these organizations. Raymond later and also Ahsan. The last thing I want to explain is that how nature of this work does not belong to women. This deal with Ahsan's principle. This is actually problematic on two grounds. One, because other principles like state obligations, second on principle to preserve life, and also this might override this principle itself. OG need to explain why these principles are more important and able to weigh over the preservation of life right. And this problem, this is the urgency, the weight here is urgency. Twofold. One, because people lose their job when they are facing issues like poverty, unemployment, homelessness. These are the struggles that these individuals have post-colonialism. That's why Praveen's argument and also extensions is significantly important in this debate because this is how they protect the most vulnerable people at the end of the day. The second thing is you only take away major environment resources, which means that what are the metrics to call it a major environment resources? Birth lottery happened also under the side of the house because if my country has multiple ordinary environment resources, I can manipulate it, I can get all the resources from it. The birth lottery issue also exclusively happens under OG then. They also prove two things there at the end of the speech. One, on how they're going to get political pressure. I've answered that why you don't get it in the off-bench, because under the comparative, country pressure to other nations, where there are more conflicting pressure, who UN is going to listen to. The second is in CO, call-out mechanism becomes significantly easier, because it's not too far-fetched for indigenous people to call out the issue in their home ground, because you can call out to either your government, to your authorities then. Your indigenous people cannot report to UN. The second thing that they prove is huge capacity. But where they get the funding and also capacity from? The superpower that gave funding, i.e. US and China. UN will accommodate the major country, even if not when there is conflict opinion. This capacity that they try to claim, which is the funding from superpower, are going to pull out. Let's deal with CG. CG claim equal distributions. There are a few problems. One, they claim preemptive limit how much you can use. One, how you determine the limit, redistribution will never go far. What are the metrics for you to determine how much you want to give it to this country? And so far this is unclear. Disputes are more likely to happen between countries under your side of the house. The second is on how equal distributions. This is actually problematic because there are money online. These resources can actually convert into money that actually can fund the country. Corruption are more likely to happen if it's like how O explained. It is far worse under CG because money incentivizes people to be corrupt, which means the system will still be flawed, the system will still be unfair. The last thing that they claim is that, soft stance, they will say that, they will give them the resources when they desperately need it. This is extremely soft because Raymond just said that there are limits, but Mior said that they will be regulated. Don't let Raymond get away because of his reputation. Let's quickly go to opening opposition. The way here on opening opposition is extremely simple because opening opposition only explain that these states died very likely to be bad, and also that they are are more likely to become monopoly. Our contribution just basically outweigh this. One, because we're able to explain to you that why we are able to get fastest access and also agency to get these resources at a key period, which is post-colonial states. We explain that this is the important factor. Second, we also explain that why this was the most important access urgently that was needed for post-colonialism, because there's no way for them to improve their quality of life. There's no way for them to get out of whatever struggle that they have right now. Our case isn't contingent on all these universal jurisdiction that you try to run. It is harder under your side of the house because you cause basically hidden explorations. The last thing I want to explain is that we also explain that the only way for you to evaluate this debate shouldn't be about the environment. This debate is actually about helping people, because this is a resources debate. Resources could be maximized under our side of the house in order to help the people that we think is vulnerable in this debate. But before that, go.
So I got no rap like Raymond, but you cannot use examples from status quo to say why our world will be shit when that is examples from the status quo that you have to defend. We told you why with the world that we prefer, we get a central authority, we get visibility on violations, and we get an ability to demand reparations.
Your model
what is your path?
Your model is some sort just like status quo, UN regulations, people voting. The problem, like how your people going to vote are still the same. Your majority will still not get, your minority will still not get reputations. Better POI go.
So there are multiple UN resolutions that condemn Israeli military occupation of Gaza. Your issue is the lack of enforcement, not with the jurisdiction itself. If these are enforceable, would you be okay with the universal jurisdiction?
The first thing you have to prove is they are actually enforceable. I will give you two reasons why these are not going to be enforced. The first reason is because of the power mismatch. Both countries are basically different capital. UN have to listen to the country with higher capital. The second reason as to why this is untrue is because they need, when there's conflicting opinion, they can only listen to one. Who they will choose? The one that they get benefit from. Who? The one that they get funding, they give funding. The one that they get help from. These are not the capacities. Let's quickly go to the last thing, right? Why Praveen's argument is winning this debate? The first is on post-colonial period, why this is important, because we explained to you that states will still exploit the people in other form. Why universal jurisdiction is the tipping point, I'm unsure. We already have international actors like Paris Agreement. We think this is pretty cool in the status quo. We don't need something new to waste more money. The last thing we're going to explain is that leverage for nations. I think this basically will diversify the economy privately explained to you, because when you develop into tertiary sector, for example, tertiary sector, you're unlikely to exploit and also you're more likely to protect the environment there. Why are people more likely to protect environment when they're not poor? Because environment is not as proximate as the problem like the food on table. The impact here is simple, guys. Twofold. The first is on capacity to improve quality of life. Because of post-colonial states, recovery is very important. The water might be yellow in the river, but the food of the unfortunate Brazil citizens comes first. The last thing I want to argue is the impact on how we shift mindset to protect environment. Our case are outcome independent judge. Three other houses hinges on how this system operates and how whether this actor being good or not. Our arguments both hinges on that. We win the debate. CO win.
You. I like it.
Record lah.